Hello, and welcome to the New Mission Career Transition Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Caprellian. I'm joined by my co-host, sister, and HR pro, Alexandra Caprellian, sitting right next to me, because she's joining us from New York. She's down in Nafik, Virginia. And today's guest is Tab Bartley. Tab Bartley is my hero. She is a marketing and public affairs Marine that her last duty was on recruiting duty and transitioned out, and she now works for the USDA. But she had a very interesting story on how she got from where she was to where she is today, including being the host of the Oath We Took podcast. One of the things I didn't expect from our recording session is the deep dive into a different view of the federal hiring process, including, and I have it written down here, special hiring authorities that allow you to bypass certain application processes. Very informative. I've got links in the episode notes, but you're going to want to hear how she used it, including a creative way of using that post 9/11 GI Bill in a way that I never thought you could. So please stay tuned. Tab Bartley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Yeah, so this is a little bit different. I've got my sister. She joined me from New York. So we're in my my poor man studio.
Super fancy.
Yeah, super fancy. And very excited to have you on. I had the pleasure and the privilege of coming on your podcast, The Oath We Took. I got to share a little bit of my story, and I think your story is very applicable to our listeners who are preparing for their own transition. And you have a very interesting and impressive resume and portfolio of work. But before we get into that, Tab, I'd like to ask you some of the same question I ask a lot of our guests, just to help our audience understand who you are and where you came from. Let's start with that. Where'd you grow up, and how did you join the Marine Corps?
Yeah, so I am from Lafayette, Indiana, and most nobody really knows where that is, but I say Purdue University, or in between Indianapolis and Chicago, Illinois. And I never had any aspirations to join the military. I was actually a 21st Century Scholarship recipient in Indiana. I was going to community college, was going to either go into social work or maybe one day go on Broadway, when a recruiter called and was like, "Hey, you want to come in and talk about the Marine Corps?" I was like, "I guess," but there's like no way I'm joining. Like, that's not happening. Well, ended up joining the Marine Corps.
All right, great. Well, what did you do in the Marine Corps?
I did public affairs, which was, I started out as a journalist, was trained in photography, media relations, public relations, and community relations.
And you're also the bearer of the Marine Corps recruiting blood stripe ribbon as well.
Well, I don't have a recruiting ribbon. MPAs did not get it at that time. I don't know if they're getting it now, but yeah, we did not rate a recruiting ribbon.
Oh gosh, I feel so bad. It's like I
Yep.
put salt on that wound because, oh man, I'm sorry. I will tell you, when I was on, our marketing and public affairs Marines were so essential to the mission, and they worked just as hard. And a lot of times they would be handing off area canvassing contacts to our recruiters, and they would turn into contracts. They would turn into future Marines. And so, wow, I'm so sorry.
Good one.
But yeah, it's a good way to start off. Insult the guest,
Good way to start it off. Hey.
Oh, geez.
Can only go up from here.
That's right. That's right. Here's a dumpster fire. Well, I just, okay, so let's go to the next question. The next question is like, what was your impetus for getting out of the Marine Corps, and did you have a game plan? What was it?
So I always say that I never would have wished my transition on anybody. I was injured 6 months after having my third child, went on a hike, postpartum, and ended up in the emergency room the next day with multiple organ prolapses. If you know anything about the military, you know nothing medical happens fast, and especially if it's women's care, because that is all considered specialty care. And so months of fighting to try to figure out exactly what was wrong, what would be the treatment, to then go up for the determination of if I would be put on a med board. And this was 5 days before my EAS, and the medical provider decided it wasn't life or death and that the VA could fix me. So essentially, I did not really prepare for my transition because I wasn't able to. I didn't have any idea of when I would be transitioning. So although I kind of had a resume and had been doing interviews, I couldn't tell anybody when I would be available. So it didn't really amount to much. And at the same time, I had so much physically and mentally going on with that was my primary focus. And me and my husband were dual military, but he had made the decision to get out of the Navy so I could stay in the Marine Corps because my career was progressing. So there was not a lot of planning when it came to the transition. What I will say is when I joined the Marine Corps, I was dead set on it being public affairs. I knew that was the job I wanted because I knew I wanted to do those things or something similar when I got out. So it only made sense to me to do what I wanted to do because I saw the military as my replacement for my college education, which, I decided to join instead of continuing. So I was prepared in that sense of I had picked a MOS or a job in the military that did transition very well and it didn't take as much, I think, translation into civilian language for what I did. So it was a lot of, I guess we'll just go back home and use these skill sets and kind of figure it out from there. So there was not a lot of prep.
Correct me if I'm wrong. And I think talk about a fortuitous choice of MOS, because my understanding is that the joint school that trains all of our ComStrat Marines, I know we changed from public affairs to strategy and communications, but that joint school is top notch and it teaches essentially the same. It has complete applicability in the civilian sector. Was that your impression? Is that your takeaway or agree?
So it does for people who knows what it is. So what I will say is it does, and it had this prestige and it's internationally recognized. And so I thought it would be pretty easy for me to find a job in the civilian world. Federally, yes. Non-federally and back home in Lafayette, Indiana, that knows nothing about the military or anything like that, it wasn't. My experience really didn't matter because I didn't have a degree. And because of my gender, a lot of people were like, well, were you a civilian? Like, I don't understand when you say you were in the Marine Corps. And I was like, no, I was a Marine. I wore the uniform. Like, everything on my resume is what I did. And so I was finding that often. And it was I wasn't expecting that again, because I picked an MOS that has a prestigious school and training and all of these things. So I wasn't expecting to jump into like those type of issues in the transition. And yes, the Defense Information School is probably one of the best schools, military schools there is around. It is very much like going to a university in regards to like, we're celebrating the 60th anniversary in August and they're having a massive alumni day. So it is very prestigious. And in the federal workforce, people know what it is and know what it means to have gone there. But when you come from a non-military, community and part of America, that's where I think the disconnect was. And I didn't realize that because everywhere I went in the Marine Corps were military installations. So even those civilians knew what it was, if that made sense. So it was definitely a benefit to have gone there, but I moved somewhere where it still kind of was a challenge.
That's I've heard similar challenges, but what I didn't take into account was the challenges as a Marine that's female, trying to communicate like, no, I wore the uniform. That I'm sorry, this might be a new wound I'm opening. I'm so sorry.
Cringing.
And I didn't know, because for me, my gender, majority of the time in the Marine Corps was like a positive thing, especially on recruiting duty. I mean, I constantly had recruiters that were like, hey, you want to come do a CFC, combat fitness challenge, because I had previously coached volleyball. Or you want to come do this so they can see that there's a female. Or like when I was pregnant, do you want to come talk to these, young women about that you can have children and be in the military. And of course I was always like, well, yeah, I mean, it's what I do.
Yeah.
It's what I'm doing. Would love to do that. And so I think it was just very jarring for, plus, with what I was going through with my disabilities and injuries, all of a sudden my gender mattered so much. And so that was not something I thought I was going to deal with on my transition.
Mm. Okay, so when you got out of the service, like, kind of tell me where did you go? What did you do?
So, we had, again, 5 days before my end of service. So I went back home because it was like, where is my most support system? So I went back home to Lafayette, Indiana. I had a lot of challenges because I couldn't physically stand for more than 10 to 15 minutes without severe pain. Was having mental, because of the physical disabilities, it was causing anxiety and panic attacks and a bunch of other physical ramifications, complex migraines. But I wasn't technically disabled because I had not gone through the VA yet, because the whole time while in, I was just trying to be seen. And so trying to find a job in my career field, photography or journalism, I couldn't physically do it. I couldn't guarantee that I could do it. I couldn't guarantee that I could go out and take photos of an event or cover an event or stand for more than 15 minutes. So I had all of these challenges that I never thought I would ever have in my transition of, now I'm having to have all these skill sets that I can use, but I also have to look at the job and the duties, and I'm not protected. And I can't talk about my physical ailments because it's not like it is in the military, where your physical health is such a normal thing to talk about because it affects everybody around you, essentially. And so, I had multiple hip surgeries while in. That's not a big deal. People ask how you do it, those type of things. In the civilian world, you can't talk about that. And then furthermore, you could potentially be discriminated. And so TAPS is teaching you to, like, especially for women, not talking about having children. Don't talk about this. Don't talk about that. And it was really challenging because I didn't feel like I could be myself. And so interviews were a lot harder than I thought they were, because I felt like I was hiding so much about myself, even though I probably wouldn't have brought those things up, but feeling like I couldn't talk about them. And so I was looking at a lot more administrative type jobs, and jobs that, like, in the description, I could say for certain that I would just be sitting there. And luckily, Purdue University is one of the biggest employers in that area and is a great place to work for. And so I applied for a job. At that time, it was called Purdue Research Foundation, but it's now Purdue for Life, which is the fundraising side of the house. And I was like, well, recruiting, fundraising, like, okay, I can see where my skill sets would really fit in there, especially when they were talking donor stewardship, because for me, that's kind of what I did in the Marine Corps, but people were donating their lives, not their money or their, families' lives and that. And so I was like, I think I can do that. That makes sense. And so I applied at Purdue University, and luckily was able to get a job there. And it was definitely what I needed more than anything, to be in that type of environment and to be at a place that was so adamant about work-life balance. Like, I wasn't allowed to have a laptop because my work did not require me to do work after hours. They knew I was a veteran, and that was actually part of the appeal, but I was only, like, one of 3 veterans in the organization. And so there were a lot of interesting challenges that, although I was back home and had the support system, I also then felt like I was in this different world at the same time. But it was a good transition in regards to, finally, I think after that point, finding somebody that saw the value in my experience, as where every interview, or like, oh, we've decided something else, or even just questioning in interviews, it started to feel like my experience didn't matter. And that was a challenge, because 8 years in the Marine Corps, I never felt like what I did didn't matter.
Yeah, I'm just imagining how hard it is to overcome that obstacle and bridge that gap in understanding and conveying the value you bring, particularly when there's this bias towards immediately looking at the education on a resume and then using that as the first filter criterion whether or not they're going to read the rest. I'd like to think that the labor market is moving in a slightly different direction, but I don't have a pulse on that, and I wouldn't know. So certainly it sounds like very difficult challenge to overcome. How long did you work at Purdue?
So I was at Purdue for 3 years. I started out as an administrative assistant and then moved up to program manager for unit campaigns. So although it was higher education and obviously degrees really matter there, they really looked at my experience and what I did and they saw the value in that and they really acknowledged that. But I wasn't doing public affairs. I had my dream job in the Marine Corps, right? And that was part of the challenge for me was I already did my dream job. It was the Marine Corps. Everything about it I loved. I never did the same thing every day. I was always interacting with people. And so I knew that my ultimate goal was eventually to get back into that, but it didn't look the same in the civilian sector. Oftentimes it would be just a photography position or a director position, but they expected you to do every little bit of the entire program. And then you would look at the compensation and it's like, I know how much work all that is, and that does not equal the amount of work and or the skills that I spent 8 years, in the Marine Corps doing. And so I just wasn't finding things that were matching up in regards to what they were asking for and what, I wanted to do. And I also, again, I felt very fulfilled in the Marine Corps. And so I wanted to do something that was fulfilling. And not that Purdue wasn't, I just wasn't seeing the impact. I was so, far behind the scenes that I didn't get to see the impact. And so that was something that I was searching for. I didn't know when it would happen. I had more of a 5 to 7 year plan where it was like, okay, in 5 to 7 years, that's when I'll transition again from Purdue and hopefully be back in the public affairs marketing world.
Okay. And before you got back into that, I noticed, because I scoured your resume on LinkedIn, where did running for the Indiana State Senate happen? Oh gee, Tab, let's take it easy on you.
So let me first say I have no political aspirations. I never have. I was known as Blunt Bartley in the Marine Corps. That's not something that anybody ever would have been like, yeah, that girl's gonna run for office one day. Nope, not at all. But in my transition, I was struggling so much and I wasn't telling my story. And I don't like to say that I was suicidal, but in my transition, I understood how a veteran could come to the point of suicide. And my greatest fear was dying. I had panic attacks because I was so scared all the time that I was dying and death was chasing me. And it got to the point where even though I wasn't suicidal, I felt like such a burden that I thought that would be the answer and that would be better for my husband or my family who is, picking up all the pieces. And I was really alone and even with all the support system. And so on my darkest day, I kind of had a breakdown, and it just so happened in that moment that one of my Marines called just out of the blue, checking to see how you are, so on and so forth. And it kind of helped me get out of that. And then my husband helped me to seek, the mental health I needed. And I will forever be an advocate for the VA in regards to that. And my husband and his support. And so in that moment, I knew that I had to do something. I had all of this support and I still got to that point. And I didn't want anybody to get there. And so because my gender played such a role and in the community and how the community saw me, I started an organization and in meetings for women veterans and trying to build the gap between women veterans and veterans in general in the community. And as I was doing that and talking about that, one day I ended up on a podcast. And after recording a podcast the next day, the woman called and she was like, have you ever considered running for office? I was like, nope. Mm-mm. She's like, okay, well, I get it. However, your district, District 7, they don't have anybody running. And you're talking about the education system there. You're talking about women's health there. You're talking about veterans. And those are all the things that that district desperately, and the state of Indiana desperately needs help with. And so I sat on it, went home, talked to my husband, and it was just like, I don't believe in happenstance and things just happening to happen. And so I took it as a sign, called my employer saying, am I even allowed to run for office while I work at Purdue University? And HR is like, yeah, just don't use our equipment and don't, those type of, I think, at least normal for, I would say, public affairs, where it was like, well, yeah, that's common sense stuff. Great. So yeah, I ended up running for state senate. And it was a great experience. It really was. I'm not sure I would ever run again, but it was a great experience. And we did what we wanted with the campaign, which was to drive change. We operated the campaign different than I'd seen other campaigns ran. It was pretty much a one-woman show. And oh, by the way, it was COVID and I was pregnant. So it was a great experience. Obviously, we didn't end up winning, but there were people who had never registered to vote, and they registered to vote so they could vote, so that the hope was, that I could be in office and so that we could make the change happen and the issues. And there were people who had never voted for that party and voted for that party. And I was a very nonpartisan person running, because it was, I think, being a veteran, it was like, here's the problem. We just have to do what we can to find the solutions to this problem, and nothing else should matter. And so, yeah, I ran for office and I learned a lot.
So what did you learn? Like, now that you have the benefit of hindsight, what are like 2 takeaways, things that you learned from that process despite not getting elected?
I think the first thing is, and this honestly goes back to recruiting, but it was just solidified, kneecap to kneecap conversations can make change happen. They can. It doesn't have to be this dog and pony show of things. We can make change happen just by having kneecap to kneecap conversations with people. And the second, most of us have no idea what our elected officials are actually voting on. And it's as simple as looking at what they vote on and not looking at anything else, not their party, not what they tell you, what they actually vote on. And that's all accessible for us, and it's all public, and we're able to see all of it.
I would imagine it's even more true the more local you get. Like, that's kind of to not go down the route. I'm not going to talk about politics, but the national news media, which has the greatest attention of the market, will bring up national level issues. Sometimes they're not even like the most pertinent national level issues. And meanwhile, a lot of people's eyeballs are captivated by that. But the reality is, it's your local elected officials and your state elected officials that are making decisions that have actually the greatest impact on you and your families. And so, I mean, I just, good on you for trying to make a difference and making a difference at the local level. I'm sure that was something that, now that you've been exposed to, that is probably even more annoying to you than it is to most folks that don't look at it.
It is. And I agree. I think like that's where the real impact is made and started. And, I even said, like, when I was running, I would never have anything to do federally. Like, there's so much change that needed to happen and could happen in Indiana, that's where like we needed to have our conversations instead of these massive talking points that just like did nothing, do nothing for anybody. Instead, like, what are the actual like issues and things we're talking about?
That's great. So you're working at Purdue, but you got back into kind of your wheelhouse. Tell us the story about what you're doing now and how you got there.
Yep. So part of working at Purdue and, kind of having this 5 to 7 year goal, I knew I had to maintain and continue my experience that I had had in the Marine Corps in regards to the photography, social media management, public affairs, and all of that. And so I used my volunteer work to continue doing those type of things and really used it as an opportunity so that there was never a kind of break in my resume. I was doing these things. I was just volunteering while I was doing them. And so when I first got out, I knew a FMF corpsman who had worked for USDA, and I had given him my resume and was just like, I would love to work at USDA and do public affairs. Like, that seems awesome. I'm from Indiana, like cornfields and all of that, right? Awesome. And it wasn't until 2021, and this was before I even interviewed for my second position at Purdue. And they were like, hey, we have an opening on our team, and we can potentially, they're looking at doing a non-competitive hire for a disabled veteran. You're disabled, right? And I was like, yes, but like, what the heck is this? What are you talking about? I don't have a federal resume. Like, I was pretty comfortable then, and I had, again, a 5 to 7 year plan. So I was like, I don't know if I want to jump through all these hoops to do all these things right now. Like, I need more details. And he was like, no, you would contact our veteran liaison person, and you wouldn't go through USA Jobs. You just give them their resume and you would just interview for it. And I was like, you can do that?
You can do that?
You could get in the federal government that way? Like, I was very like confused. And so he's like, don't worry, just send me your resume. Like, update your resume to right now and send it to me. And I'm like, okay. And so he sends it. And of course he sends it to a Marine. And so this Marine reaches out to me and he's like, oh, I see you're on recruiting duty. I was the XO on recruiting duty. And I'm like, what? Oh, you went to DIMFOS. You know what DIMFOS is? Like, I'm just sitting here like in email, like, what is happening right now? Like, I'm so confused by this. And he's like, yeah, your resume looks wonderful. They want to schedule an interview. What? Like, that's it? Yeah, I just need your letter saying you're disabled. You're 30% disabled, and we'll get the show going. And I'm like, okay. I'm missing something. Like, this is I am missing something. This is some sort of a setup, whatever. And do the interview. Absolutely, like, love the people I was interviewing with. One of the supervisors, one of the first things out of his mouth was like Semper Gumby, and that's like one of my favorite things in the Marine Corps, right? You got to do what you got to do, be flexible. And at the same time I interviewed for that, Purdue had, this job opening, and I interviewed for that as well. And what I wasn't prepared for was how long the federal hiring is. So I did not get really any feedback after my interview besides it was good. Now, they were still keeping in contact with me. And so I got the other job offer. And so I took it because why wouldn't I, right? Like, why wouldn't I? And so it wasn't until 6 months later that it was like, here is the official federal, write-up of here's your official offer to work for USDA Agriculture Marketing Service as a public affairs, GS11 with 2 promotions built in. So I would be a 13 by the end of it.
I'm sorry. I just need because this is like getting fascinating. What do you mean by 2 promotions built in?
So it is a hiring scale where essentially, because it was a non-competitive hire, they were able to put it in where after each year I would be assessed. And if I got the thumbs up, I would go to the next grade. So
really?
I was an 11, and then I was a 12, and now I'm a 13. And this is without a degree, which is very, very hard. And I think it's thought of most often that it doesn't happen. But there are a ton of federal jobs that the degree isn't. When it says like education requirement, it'll say or in lieu of, you've done it, like you have the experience and you've done it, can be in lieu of the education. And I guess I had never seen that before, or on, the federal jobs that I had looked at. I guess I didn't know what I was looking at. And so this for me was like, I'm working for higher education. At some point, there's going to be a level that like I can't go any higher without a degree. Fairly so. Okay, like that's fair. But for me in life, I had 4 kids. I didn't want to go to school. I was in a career field that's so ever evolving. I didn't think it made sense. Could I maybe pick something else? Sure, but then what's the point? Because that's not what I want to do. And so this for me was like, well, this, you can't really argue somebody's GS rating. So I was like, so if I got a federal position and I end up a 13, then that's the validation that I seem to be missing because I didn't have a degree. In regards to hiring, not that I needed that validation, if that makes sense. I know I didn't need that validation, but it was obviously needed when looking for jobs. And the fact that the process was so easy, I didn't think federal hiring could be that easy. I did one interview. I gave one person my resume. And I was hired.
Wow. I've never heard of it. Well, granted, I'm a neophyte when it comes to civil servant hiring just in the command that I'm in, but nothing sounds the delay not surprising.
Yes. Yes.
But the ease with which you were able to apply, as opposed to having that like ridiculous 10 to 15 page resume that USA Jobs makes you essentially fill out. And on the hiring panel, it's a burden to even have to read through all of that. So that's fascinating. I don't even know. I mean, is that it just makes me wonder, is that even a universal federal hiring practice where if you have 30, really?
It is.
30% disability.
So they are called special hiring authorities, and there is a number of them, and they are called Schedule A. And so it's not just for disabled veterans. There's also one for military spouses. There are one for people with disabilities. There are a number of them. You can just do a quick Google search of special hiring authorities, and OPME will pop up all that information. But there's a lot of hiring managers who aren't utilizing it because they don't know the value because they've done the same thing the same way. It's streamlined. It's a way that does not cost the unit or the program as much money in the hiring process. And you have the opportunity to get people who maybe wouldn't have gotten in the federal service, like myself. I didn't think I was going to be ready for it for 5 to 7 years. Now I was working towards it, but and I'm not saying I'm an amazing person, but I've done some things for the agency that wouldn't have been done potentially if I hadn't have been there. And so this is happening. USDA uses it. A lot of, USDA has 29 agencies. A lot of our 29 agencies use it. And on LinkedIn, I'm seeing other agencies use it and posting on LinkedIn that, hey, I'm looking for disabled veterans. There was one for AI. It was AI specific, GS-15 remote. And so you want to find those hiring authorities within these agencies, follow these agencies, find those people, because they're posting these opportunities, but they're not on USA Jobs because they don't have to be put on USA Jobs because they're a special hiring authority. And so they are out there. But networking is, I think, really how you find them, and having these people in your web, because it's not, you can't just Google search or search on USA Jobs. And so that's why I think a lot of times people don't hear about it and don't know about it.
Oh, man.
Now I want to work for a federal hiring instead of the 12-step process that we have to do in like the civilian world of just this constant interviewing and reviewing and
and don't get me wrong, there's still that, and it's not a smooth, fast process. And I will say my onboarding, that's something USDA is working on. The onboarding was not it. Now it was still post-COVID where I was in Indiana, but I was moving to the DC area. But my supervisor had to handle the onboarding, and they're not HR. And I have great supervisors, but that was a stark contrast to Purdue, which has onboarding. Like my onboarding at Purdue was the most beautiful thing I've experienced, to the point of the first time, at least for me, filling out the tax form, they're like, this is the tax form you have to fill out. And I'm just looking at them like, I've never filled this out. What is this? And the HR, it comes from a military family, and she was like, hey, Tab, we'll meet with you after this alone so we can, ask, you can ask your questions. And so it definitely wasn't like that beautiful on regards to like that, like onboarding experience into the organization. They're working on it. They realize it. It is a big department in agency, but the rest of the experience, right? I mean, it was completely worth it.
Okay. That's great. one of the things that you told me about before in our previous conversation, you had mentioned that you had used the post 9/11 GI Bill, but in a unique way. Could you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
So this was the other kicker. So initially, when they said, when they were, before I got the official offer, and the veteran liaison was talking about this would be a GS 11, you would, in a year be promoted to 12, in a year and 13. And I was looking at the cost of that, looking at the cost of how much it would be to move from Indiana to Virginia. And I have 4 children. I was like, even though it's a GS 11, I don't know if I can afford it. I know how much houses cost over there. And I will say Indiana has a wonderful cost of living. We just bought our first home a year and a half ago. And he was like, no worries. Have you used your GI Bill? I was like, no, I wasn't in 10 years, so I couldn't, transfer it to my kids either. So it's just there. He's like, awesome. What we can do then is you can do on the job training for 3 years, utilizing your GI Bill. So he's the one who has to fill this out through the VA. So it's VA funds, but it was a housing stipend for 3 years. Now it decreased every year. And then like by the end, certain years, math is not my thing, so I won't get into that. But I was able to use a portion of my GI Bill so that we could afford to move here and live here. And essentially, it kind of pretty much broke us out even to where it was almost like I was a 13 the whole time, in a way, a 13 or a 12. Again, I'm not good at math, so don't quote me on that specifically. But that's how we were able to move here. And because it wasn't posted on USA Jobs, they couldn't reimburse me for my moving, but they were able to request a recruiting bonus. So even in federal, you have a way to negotiate and ask for things and to get what you need, or to get, what would equal you moving and uprooting your whole family, to support that organization. And you shouldn't be shy about it. Now, I was lucky. If that veteran liaison hadn't been liaisoning, would I have asked for any of those things? No, I wouldn't have known I could. I wouldn't have even known how to. But that's another beautiful thing about, I think, like federal service and a lot of these agencies. So many of them have a veteran liaison who is actually looking out for you. Now, granted, he was a Marine, so that's probably why he was so awesome. But hey.
No.
That's no, a great point. Like seeking out a veteran liaison with other federal government agencies, and probably just this story of your hiring process probably being very different from the hiring process within any other federal government organization, to include any other military organization. It sounds like there are just varying degrees in which HR departments leverage, like what you had mentioned, the special hiring authorities, or having an understanding of it. And there are probably some institutional or organizational biases on what they'll allow and not allow. But it sounds like USDA, despite maybe their onboarding needing a little bit of love, it sounds like they've got it. They know how to attract talent and leverage the provisions within the federal hiring process to attract and retain that talent. Would you agree?
I would. And I would say it's not so much so when I say hiring authorities, that's not so much the HR, that's like the supervisors.
Okay.
So it's not really the HR. A lot of the HRs, and I say this so I'm the president of USDA's Veteran Employee Organization, so I interact with kind of the side of the house with them. A lot of the HRs are trying to get people to use them, but the supervisors and those who are looking for those positions, they don't fully understand them. And that, if you don't fully understand things, sometimes you don't utilize them. And so there has been a big push. And then there's been a big push federally, especially when we look at the hiring of military spouses and looking at that special hiring authority for military spouses. So there are definitely opportunities out there, and there are tons of people who are utilizing them. It's just harder because you really need to build a network and or know exactly what you want to do. It's easy to find public affair jobs when I'm looking for public affairs jobs. It's hard to find a federal job that I meet the duties for, right? Like if you're so broad, it's really hard to find it. But knowing exactly what you're looking for makes it easier because you can find all the agencies that have that job. That's a trick I always use on USA Jobs. Whatever it is you want to do, search that job, not just to see what's available, but what agencies are offering that job. And then finding people within those agencies who you have a connection to. Are they a veteran? Did they go to the same school you went to? Are they from the same state as you? Are they doing the same job? Can you connect with them? Or are they the veteran liaison? And now you follow them or interact with them on LinkedIn. And it doesn't have to be such a high pressure thing of they're looking for a job right now or they have a job right now. Instead, you're building that network so that when they see your content or they know that you can do something, when they have the opportunity to use a special hiring authority, maybe they think about you, because that's what happened to me. I was just still sharing my story of what I had the capability to do and my skill sets, and doing it so constant that people thought about me when there was an opportunity to fill a spot.
Mm. So to use some terminology that we might have used on recruiting duty, and it might sound familiar, you're talking about looking through USA jobs, identifying those organizations that are hiring the positions, and then a very Marine term, penetrating those organizations by we're going to talk about human intelligence and finding the key leader in a network, but you're attacking the network via LinkedIn and using the search query to find, okay, who's the veteran associated with that organization, and perhaps even the veteran in the department of the organization that can at least give me some information on everything that I need to know to fine tune my resume, crush it in the interview, and probably get an internal referral.
And or even, is that the job you want to do? Especially for so many, I feel like so many veterans aren't like me, where what they did in the military is exactly what they want to do in the civilian sector. And even, like I said, even with my experience of what I thought marketing and public affairs was going to be in the civilian sector was not the same as it is federally. And so knowing that and having that opportunity to converse with people and to even ask them, so that, again, you can decide, like, this is what I want to hunt for, this is what I want to look for, this is for certain what I want to do. It's not always a big ask. And I think that's the beauty of LinkedIn. And I think you'll find a lot more benefit from LinkedIn when you're not looking at the big asks of people. People like to talk about themselves, and they probably will. Just get them to talk about themselves, and you can learn a lot from that.
And I've even found that, like, just from this podcast experience and reaching out to people that I didn't know, my rejection rate is pretty low when it comes to, hi, I am so-and-so in this branch of service. I'm planning on transitioning, and I don't know what I want to do, but what you've done in your portfolio of work is extremely interesting. Would you mind sparing 20 minutes to talk to a military veteran or active duty military person and let me know, like, see if this is something I want to pursue? I haven't had anybody come back and say no. I've had people not respond, and they're probably just not active on LinkedIn. But yeah, no, hey, thanks for that tip. I mean, that's great information. I'd also, I'd be remiss if we didn't cover this. You are the producer and host of the Oath We Took podcast. What is the origin story behind that?
Yes. So I am forever, I guess, trying to do more. I don't know. I feel like this is going to be so corny. I kind of live by the Mr. Feeney's philosophy of doing good, not doing well, not doing great things, but like doing good. And I love being around veterans. Do not get me wrong. I absolutely love veterans, but there's something about Marines. And I loved telling the story of Marines and the Marine Corps story. And one day, will I ever get back to the Marine Corps? Maybe, some way, somehow. But I couldn't wait for that. And so I was looking at kind of what, with my limited time and capacity, how could I continue to tell the Marine Corps story? I don't have time for writing. My writing style is just too crazy and all of that. And so when I was looking into it, at that point I had been on quite a few podcasts, and I was like, I think podcast, that's my favorite part of when I was writing and doing journalism, was interviewing somebody and talking to somebody. And I was like, I think I can do this. And then my brother does a podcast for Purdue. And I was like, how much does this cost? Can I do this on low to no budget? He's just like, yeah, here's my Zoom account. You can use it. And here's the microphone you need. And I think there was like 2 other things. And I was like, okay, I can afford that. I'll do this. And so What We Took podcast was born. And I really wanted to tell the stories that often aren't told, or the Marines who don't feel like their stories matter or should be told, or like they didn't do enough. And so that was also the name. I really want to reiterate that it's about the oath you took. And that's the significance of being a veteran and serving, is that you took that oath and you were willing to give your life for this country, and your story matters. You don't need to be the first person to do something. You don't need to have saved babies and done all of these things. And your story is still so beautiful and it still matters so much. And that's Marine Corps history. And it's not always the good stuff, right? It's the, what can the Marine Corps do better? It's the trials and the tribulations, and know yourself and seek self-improvement. And so that's where the podcast came about. I wanted it to be people's unfiltered and raw stories, and that they had control over their stories. And I'm just facilitating a place that that story can live.
And I appreciate the fact that there's a uniqueness to every person's story, that on the face of it, it's not like the high action packed implied, billet description. But then when you actually listen to the stories and you realize this is a human being who I have something in common with, who's out there telling something that really kind of speaks home to me and maybe even informs me through their story, I find it actually just, I don't know, I'm trying to seek the word, but I love your podcast. And I think it's also beneficial to those that are, maybe they're living in places in the Midwest where they're not living around a Marine Corps community, and you can get on this thing and you can realize like there are others out there that you probably have something in common with, and it's cathartic. It's comforting.
Mm-hmm.
It's like mom's meatloaf. It's comfort food for the soul. I like it. I love it.
And I think
anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting cheesy.
No, and that was the goal. And I have one podcast episode that I don't know will ever air, and it kind of doesn't matter if it did, but this Marine told me their story of their attempted suicide and what they were going through, and they had never shared it before, and they thought that they were ready, and then they realized, they weren't ready for their mom to hear it, and so on and so forth. But the fact that Marine in that moment felt so comfortable with me to tell their story, it was like I knew I was doing some good, and that's what I needed to keep doing with it.
This is funny. You said like one day you hope to give back to the Marine Corps. Now, you and I may have a different opinion on this. The institution doesn't have feelings, and I don't love anything that can't love me back. But the human beings in that institution do. And so you ask whether or not you can give back to the Marine Corps. I would say, Tab, you're giving back to the most important part of the Marine Corps, and it's the Marines that wore the uniform. So thank you for what you do, because there's no doubt in my mind that there are listeners that will never reach out to you, but you're helping through your medium. So good on you. I think we've kind of run up a little bit on our time here.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to give you an opportunity, because this is so much great information. We talk about the federal hiring process. I didn't think we'd get into that. The GI Bill and a different application of it. This is like a goldmine of information. And so I hope you got 2 more in you, because I'm going to ask you a standard question I ask all of our guests. Are there 2 or 3 things that you would like service members to remember as they prepare for their own transition? What are they?
I think the first thing is that your story matters. Who you are, what you did, it matters so much, and it's not something that you need to hide. I know the transition, at least for me, there was moments where I couldn't really choose where I worked. Like, we had to put food on the table type stuff, and I get that. But at some point, you need to get to the spot where you feel like you can be your authentic self, because that matters so much. And the transition doesn't just stop. I got out in 2018, and I feel like I'm still transitioning, and for the rest of my life will be transitioning. And I think that's something that's unique, that I didn't feel that as much in the Marine Corps, even though every 3 years you're moving and doing things. they didn't seem as monumental transitions as it does out here on this side. And then I think the second thing is just make a good and bad list, positives and whatever. I had a veteran reach out to me who I had mentored and talked to, and they were asking about opportunities and what should they do. And I was like, I don't know what you should do. You need to write down everything good about it, everything bad. And I was like, and then you need to see what matters the most, because it's not what has the most good or the most bad. It's like what then has the priority of this impact and this matters the most. So I think there has to be some moments of like self-reflection and looking at where you're at emotionally. I wasn't ready for that in the transition, how much my emotions would play into things.
That's good. Any other saved rounds, sis?
No, I think you ended it so well. I just want to say thank you so much for your resilience in the beginning, because facing what you had to face, just being a female and a veteran, I cringed the entire time. So thank you for pushing through that the way you did.
And for being a voice for other women. I mean, of huge value. Tab, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate the knowledge and wisdom you're sharing. I know our guests are going to benefit from it. I'm going to benefit from it. And thanks again. I don't know what else to say.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. All right. We'll be in touch. Take care. Is this... It's the weird things we talk about when we're in the same recruiting studio. Tab has left the virtual studio. And now we just said my brain is spinning.
Yeah, his brain is spinning. It's doing somersaults. You can see it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm a dork when it comes to like supply chain management matters. And I never really thought about, well, gee, gosh, there's another federal government organization that hires GS employees that does things a little bit differently. And so now I'm like, wow, okay, I should look at USA jobs probably a little bit closer just to understand what the options are. And then if so, use LinkedIn to find a connection that is a veteran, maybe even a Marine in the supply chain management department or whatever logistics department they have. Anyway, fascinating. What were your takeaways?
Well, it was just nice to hear from another person that just doesn't have a degree, but is able to do something that she's always wanted to do, that she's dreamt about doing. I mean, being able to do that in the military and then being able to do that outside of the military, I think is great. And also, I loved her story about running for office.
Yeah.
Because I think she already won when she got the opportunity to have people that don't normally vote to vote. I think that's already a good win there.
Oh, 100%. Talk about finding a sense of purpose in it too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and I told her she should have a sense of purpose, what she's doing in the podcast realm. And I know it's helping others. Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Great.
And I learned a lot. And I hope you learned something too. If you're listening to me, bob my gums, run my suck, jack my jaw, continue to talk, and you're actually listening to this whole episode, thank you very much for listening. We appreciate it. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or subscribe to our content on YouTube. So that's where we have the video version of this posted. If you have any feedback for us, well, you could always hit either one of us up on LinkedIn. We read our messages and try and respond pretty quickly. Or you could I can't believe I'm going to say the old-fashioned way. The old-fashioned way, you could send us an email. That's newmissionct@gmail.com. That's New Mission Charlie Tango. And if you are preparing for your own transition, know that I'm right there with you. So until next time, stay focused.